Hello and welcome to Eye on Africa for your daily roundup of news from across the continent. I'm Joy Miljameen, and coming up on the show, South African Paralympic champion Oscar Pistorius has been denied parole after seeking early release from prison. This is a decade after he shot and killed his girlfriend Reeva Steenkamp. Then a policeman has died in Kenya, becoming the latest victim of violent anti-government protests. At the same time, opposition leader Raila Odinga has cried foul, claiming he's been the target of an assassination attempt. Then sellers and small business owners are becoming increasingly frustrated in Niger as a new system designed to collect more tax has reversely affected the informal sector. Well, thanks for joining us. As he was seeking an early release from prison, South African Paralympic champion Oscar Pistorius was refused parole on Friday, coming just over a decade on from shooting and killing his girlfriend Reeva Steenkamp. South Africa's Department of Correctional Services said that a parole board found Pistorius had not completed the minimum detention period required to be let out. Our correspondent in South Africa, Nadine Taron, brings us up to speed.
Oscar Pistorius will only be eligible for parole in August 2024. Upon seeking clarification, the Department of Correctional Services was only informed of this by the Department of Justice 4 days ago. This is because Pistorius' sentence changed several times, complicating calculations about how much of the sentence he had actually already spent in prison. It was this technicality that sent Pistorius back behind bars. Legal experts were shocked because they expected that the verdict would depend heavily on the victim impact statements of Reeva Steenkamp's parents. Pistorius' lawyer, Julian Knight, says he will certainly take this decision on review. June Steenkamp, Reeva's mother, arrived at a Pretoria prison where the parole hearing was heard, expecting to look Pistorius in the eyes for the first time since 2016. Even though he wasn't in the room when she testified, she found the experience stressful and painful. In her testimony, she said that the Steenkamps don't believe that Oscar's been rehabilitated or that he shows remorse. That's because they don't believe Pistorius' version of events, that he didn't know who was behind the bathroom door he shot at. June testified that they believe Pistorius intended to kill Reeva. June found the experience traumatizing but said she did it for her daughter. Barry, Reeva's father, was not present due to health reasons.
They're going to arrest us because I cannot pretend to be what I am not. Those are the words of Alex, a gay man in Uganda, where MPs last week passed what has been criticized as among the world's harshest anti-gay legislation. On Friday, the LGBTQ community of Uganda received support from protesting South Africans in Cape Town. Laurent Beshteker brings us more.
Marching in solidarity with Ugandans against the so-called anti-homosexuality bill. Hundreds of South Africans took to the streets of Cape Town and Pretoria to protest against the proposed law. Many were members of the LGBTQ community themselves and felt directly targeted by the legislation.
It's not only a Ugandan issue. It is an African continent issue. We don't deserve that. Queer people don't owe anyone anything, but we also deserve to live just like everyone else.
The law, which has been described as one of the most repressive in the world, would make it a criminal offense to identify as queer and make same-sex relations punishable by life imprisonment. It would also compel Ugandans to denounce and report homosexual activity. In addition, critics have denounced the legislation's ambiguous language and raised concerns over a potential spillover effect to other African nations. But none are more affected than queer Ugandans, many of whom are now considering fleeing the country.
I would really love to leave Uganda, so bad. But then, on the other hand, I feel like we are supposed to fight for our freedom.
The bill still needs to be approved by Uganda's president after being passed by parliament last week. But 78-year-old Yoweri Museveni has faced growing international pressure to ditch the legislation. The US recently warned of possible economic sanctions if the law was enacted.
Kenyan police have confirmed that an officer died in the western city of Kisumu from injuries sustained in clashes during opposition protests on Thursday. His death brings to 3 the number of people killed since anti-government demonstrations began on Monday last week. Opposition leader Raila Odinga has called for protests every Monday and Thursday, accusing President William Ruto of stealing last year's election and of failing to control the surging cost of living. Odinga also claims to be the subject of an assassination attempt. Take a listen.
Later on, I show these shots. You can count them. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. In fact, there are 10. There are 10 shots that were fired. And you could see that these were aimed at a passenger sitting on the other side where I was sitting. You could hear gunshots. And we thought they were firing in the air. But then we heard now the car being hit several times. That is when I decided to take cover and lie on the seat. Yeah, but there is really no mistaking the fact that the intention was basically to kill. This was basically an attempt at my life, which is really very unfortunate indeed. If this vehicle had not been an armored car, the story would be different.
Speaking at the start of a 2-day visit to Zambia, US Vice President Kamala Harris on Friday urged the country's bilateral creditors to expedite the restructuring of its debts. Zambia has been looking to restructure its debts since becoming the first African country to default during the COVID pandemic in late 2020. Its debts crept higher at the end of the year, at the end of last year, with China becoming its largest bilateral creditor. Kamala Harris, though, says her latest visit has been intended to strengthen existing relations between the United States and Zambia and not to counter the Chinese presence in Africa. This, of course, part of a week-long visit to Africa for America's Vice President. Ugandan soldiers have entered the East DR Congo border town of Bunagana on Friday as part of an East African regional military force that was announced back in June. It's the latest move to try to stabilize the troubled region, which is occupied by scores of armed rebel groups. Ugandan troops themselves are intended to supervise the gradual withdrawal of the M23 militia, who have conquered swathes of territory in eastern Congo and inflamed regional tensions. Other countries contributing to this regional force include Burundi, Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania, South Sudan, and the DRC itself. In Niger, the certified invoice system continues to frustrate sellers. Put into place by the government, it aims to promote greater transparency in commercial transactions and tax declarations nationwide. The certified invoice became mandatory in 2021, but regular inspections only began recently. In response, several strike days were organized by sellers and small businesses in Niamey in March. Meanwhile, the government attempted to soften its approach. The government attempted to soften its approach to encourage a widespread adoption of this transparency measure. Our correspondent in Niger, Harold Girard, sent us this report.
In Niger, most transactions unfold just like this. No receipt, no invoice, and at times no paper trail. But the government aims to change that by generalizing the certified invoice system, where every sale gets reported to the tax department.
When you compare the revenues of 2021 to those of 2022, the government has already started to see an increase in collected taxes, specifically due to the VAT.
And that's the very core of the issue. Niger's government suspects it's not collecting its fair share from the 19% VAT set in the country. On the other side, most sellers fear substantial losses.
We want this certified invoice system to be scrapped. so we can work in peace. The government disagrees, and so we have little hope.
In Niger, the biggest hit to the state budget doesn't come from missing out on VAT collection.
Certified invoices aren't a cure for everything. Overcharging in public contracts is still a problem, for example.
The Bazoum administration regularly claims to be fighting against these practices. In 2022, they made several high-profile arrests of government officials for fraud. When it comes to certified invoicing, the Minister of Trade himself is stepping up and urging businesses to break free from their old habits.
There are a number of sellers who are accustomed to the informal sector and thus do not want certified invoices so they can avoid paying the VAT that they pocket.
For consumers, it's also a concern. They fear this pressure on shops could drive up prices of basic goods even further.
Well, that's all the African news for now on France 24, but there's more coming up. We'll see you soon.
France 24, every art form.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.